Good afternoon, industry partners, friends of the media, and distinguished guests. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the launch of the APRW NTU WKWSCI School of Communication and Information Student Development Fund. My name is Sejal, a final year student from the WKWSCI School of Communication and Information, and it is my pleasure to be your MC for today. We're glad to have you here today, a little bit virtually, to join us for our panel discussion as well as to witness the launch of the APRW WKWSCI School of Communication and Information Student Development Fund afterwards. Our first ever APR NTU WKWSCI School panel discussion is titled Towards Effective Public Messaging Strategies, Implications for Post-Pandemic Communication. The COVID-19 pandemic showed lasting and novel challenges that public communicators will likely continue to face in the post-COVID world. Our expert panel will highlight findings from research and discuss key considerations for the communication of public health issues. Without further ado, let me introduce our panelists for today. On the stage, we have guest panelist Mr. Karl Mark, co-founder of SGAG and CEO of HEPMIL Media Group. HEPMIL Media Group is a regional media company that runs the popular digital content platforms such as SGAG, Singapore, MGAG for Malaysia, PGAG for Philippines, and HEPMIL Creators Network. The group's original content arm produces content that reaches over 30 million millennials and Gen Zs across the region weekly. Their creator network partners with over 300 of the region's top digital content creators that produces over 2 billion monthly views. Karl was named as Forbes 30 Under 30 in the Asia class of 2017. Next, we have Ms. Ginny Ann Oh, Director at APRW. As a specialist in strategic communications, messaging, and media, Ginny has worked with political, government, corporate, NGO, and philanthropic clients to create, develop, and execute integrated campaigns that understand and move key opinions with a target audience that matter. She mostly manages earned campaigns, rapid responses, and on-the-ground implementation. Ginny is one of the owners directors of APRW and brings deep experiences in corporate communications, marketing, and crisis work across a diverse range of industries, including education and real estate. Ginny is also an alumni of NTU. Next, we have Professor Mei Luen, Chair of WKWSCI School of Communication and Information, NTU. Professor Mei Luen will be sharing about how the global social media responded to the COVID-19 pandemic and its implications for health authorities. Based on her research team's work on the infodemic, she will address the issues pertaining to the population sentiments and the resultant behaviors both in Singapore and internationally. She will also draw implications for practitioners who are working in the health messaging space. Lastly, we have our moderator for the session, Associate Prof. Edson Tandok Jr., Associate Chair Research, WKWSCI School of Communication and Information, NTU. Associate Prof. Edson Tandok will also address issues on fake news and misinformation, how we communicate uncertainty, how to effectively communicate amidst fake news, and how to communicate in an environment of declining trust. Prof. Edson will also be sharing research related to these questions by drawing from research that we have been conducting in the Center for Information Integrity and the Internet in Cube at the WKWSCI School. To all our guests watching this virtually, you may enter any questions you have in the Zoom Q&A chat box, and our panelists will be glad to answer them. You can turn on the Q&A chat box from the bottom of your Zoom window. With that, I now pass the time over to the panel. Associate Prof. Edson, please.
Thank you very much, Sejal, and hello to all of those joining us on Zoom. Okay, I'll start with the first question, right? So I think what we're seeing now is how important effective communication is during a situation like this, during a pandemic. But it's also more difficult to do so now. In your experience and the research that we've been doing, what are the challenges that you're seeing when it comes to public communication at a time like this? Maybe I'll start with Prof. May.
Yes, thanks very much, Sejal, for the introduction, and thank you, Edson. I guess, I'll start off first by just laying a little bit of groundwork on the real types of challenges that we face today in the communication space. I have a slide to show you the work that we did during the Zika outbreak. So this was the most recent outbreak before the COVID-19, right? And In that, comparison, and I'm sorry, to the viewers, you'll probably see like very small words that, don't worry, you don't have to read that. I'll just kind of take you through. The top chart basically shows the conversations that were put out by the government and the health authorities on Facebook and Twitter. So you see the Facebook conversations, and they rise up as the government puts out certain types of news and so on. And at the bottom are the responses from the public. So the posts that the public has put out and so on. And what you would see is that the lines on the top, the blue lines, and the ones at the bottom, the brown lines, they are almost parallel or similar. So what was happening was that the different types of news and information that the government put out was being shared by the community and by the netizens. And and whatever was put out was being parallelly communicated. When we fast forward to COVID-19, and I think that's the next chart, which actually shows the Twitter conversations and the Facebook conversations. If I'm not wrong, the orange line is the Twitter, and the yellow line is the Facebook conversations. The blue line is the information that government has put out. And since January last year, the information has been pretty constant. Almost every day we've got news communique, right? That's constant, but then you see these mountains of information that's coming out in the public space and in the social media space. So you kind of we ask ourselves, like, where does all this like additional information come in? And I think that's where we have this whole tsunami of information, some of which are coming out from the health authorities, some of which are reconfigured, some of which are misinformation and so on. And I think that's made the whole space a very complex one.
Yep. So I'll follow up on that and ask Jenny about. This a lot of supply of misinformation at this particular time. How does that affect, or how does that impact the public communication efforts?
I think a lot of the public communications efforts now, today, cannot be very insular in nature. We have to be very reactive. So while we have a core message, core information, core education that we have to drive all the time so that the right information is out there, we have to also be actively monitoring what are the myths coming up, what's the fake news that's circulating, what's on the social, for instance, and react accordingly as well. So I would think that perhaps the blue line might have to spike a little bit alongside the other colored lines if we look at the chart, because we have to react to what is not accurate out there, so that as a populace we're better protected in this fight. Yeah.
Carl, how about you? What's the experience like from SCAG when it comes to how public communication is changing during this time?
So I think in my experience, one of the big challenges in navigating a modern day pandemic with social media being so powerful and so dominant is really the shift between what was traditional media and what is digital social media. I think in traditional media, what we see is the monopoly on distribution. That if you think back to the early days of crisis communications via print or via TV in the 80s or 90s, it was very clear. You tune in at 7 p.m. news, you read the front page of the newspaper, that is it. Everybody would probably read it, everybody would come across it. But today, majority of the young people, for example, don't consume traditional media in that same format or in that same method, right? So on social media, you have this problem where distribution is a key challenge. How do you ensure that the message from the government or authorities are sent to the right audiences at the right time, quick enough or fast enough or effective enough that allows them to understand and react in terms of their behaviors? And I think that's one of the key challenges, because the power now sits on the platforms. Even if you buy media to ensure better distribution, it does not necessarily translate into understanding and behavioral change. And I think that's one of the key challenges that I think our government saw, and also partnered with platforms like us, for example, because we do attract a large group of young people. And therefore, the communication, to Genius' point, has been kind of an effort that you need to cover all grounds. There are many grounds to cover as well. And I think that's one of the key challenges of navigating fast enough, partnering publishers, creators, official news channels, and then distributing that through technology and traditional media platforms across the populace of Singapore. And I think that is no easy feat.
So is that something that you saw over at SGAG, that during this pandemic, people actually spend even more time online than before pandemic?
I think definitely when we look at engagement rates, for example, during circuit breaker, it was extremely high for us because people are bored, right? So they are mindlessly scrolling through social media, looking for something to consume. And I think therein lies a lot of misinformation that's being consumed, a lot of foreign news also being consumed. And then we generally noticed that people were consuming a lot more content, very hungry for content, because probably there was not much else to do during that period. I think that has waned off a little bit with us returning back to being able to return to school, return to work at 50%. But certainly I think people still have relied on social media as a big channel of information, a big source of information.
Yeah. Ginny, in your work, what do you see, how is misinformation online affecting people?
I think perhaps I can speak a little bit from both my professional life and my voluntary work, because I do quite a lot of work with grassroots. And one of the key challenges I noticed in my voluntary work was that misinformation was getting to actually the seniors a little bit faster than the truth, right? The facts of the matter, the facts of the vaccines, for example. And the truth of the matter during this period of time that you rightly pointed out, we saw spikes during the CB, and some of those spikes have come down a little bit, but has held stable, especially for the young. Interestingly enough, the older ones have also been changing based on our observations. They have also changed the way they've consumed information, they receive information and receive news. So when once upon a time the elderly would rely very heavily on mainstream media, you see that a lot of them are actually on their phones now, you know, and they're eating in smaller groups, they're on their phones, they were trying to stay in touch with their friends, and they all turn to their phones. And WhatsApp, WeChat, these became big among them. So I think because of the dominance of, the increased dominance of these channels, there was a lot of, like you said, different sources of news from international sources, different types of news, fake news, misinformation. And I think when it comes to the elderly, we are particularly concerned because lives are at stake, right? I mean, if you look at the recent numbers, the deaths, a lot of, I always wonder when I see a report of the death of an elderly person, was it a result of misinformation that caused that person to choose not to be vaccinated? And I worry, I feel very sad, you know, because that could have been different. The outcome could have been different for that individual. So I think that's, to me, is a big problem because lives are at stake. Yes.
So I think what we're seeing is like two main challenges, right, that's are particularly salient during this period is first, increased use of online resources to get information or maybe even just to spend time online. And second, because people are spending more and more time online, they're also increasingly exposed to inaccurate information that can affect, you know, what they believe in and also what things they engage in. How should public communication respond to that? Meaning, I'm seeing that perhaps before, you know, when we didn't have fake news and disinformation, or not at this scale, that wasn't really like part of a job of a public communicator to engage in debunking, right? Would you say that now, if you're a public communicator, how important is debunking misinformation? Let me start with Prof. May.
Okay. You know, the job of debunking the information should not just fall on the health authorities or governments, but to all of us, you know, who are involved in various facets of communication in everyday space. And indeed, you know, this whole set of misinformation and how it has spread to many, many areas which traditionally didn't used to have a lot of misinformation is very interesting, and it affects how we respond to it. If we could just look at, I think I have a slide number 5, which actually shows a study that we did where we looked at the misinformation and we tried to categorize, so this was the 100 top episodes of misinformation, online falsehoods in Singapore. And what was really interesting to us was the pink and the red part, science and medical information, which typically did not used to be part of the misinformation space. That was prolific. A very large number was in that space. And then in the second group, we have government policies, lockdown information and so on that was coming out. And then in the third space, we also have an area that's of major concern, which is scams, falsehoods that are designed to, extract money from others. And then in the final area was what we typically saw in the misinformation of old, which is like in human stories and so on. But the fact that such a large amount of information is in the scientific space suggests that there could be strategies to counter it, not just from governments, but also in the scientific community, from academics, from the industry, and so on.
Carl, how has SGAG responded to all these challenges?
So for example, I think one of the key points that was raised to us by the health authorities was how do we debunk some of the myths of vaccination efforts? Because I think when the vaccines were announced, there wasn't, I would say, necessarily just misinformation about the effectiveness of vaccines. There was also little things like, oh, Pfizer is better than Moderna, which was this thing amongst young people that they saw, like, oh, don't bother with Moderna, the side effects are really bad, just go for Pfizer. And then you saw this situation where nobody was booking the Moderna slots when it was first announced for the 35 and below. And then you had this news that came out, I think maybe 2 weeks after, where, oh, the Moderna efficacy against Delta variant is higher than Pfizer. And then it changed, everyone's like, oh, let's go for Moderna, so you don't need the booster. So it was super confusing, I think, for the young people. So what we did with the government was to really address specific concerns that we were seeing, or they were seeing, from Gen Zs, for example, versus millennials. And how do you tackle that through, for example, content that we produce to reach them and communicate some of these misinformation, or tackle some of this misinformation directly, and then reinforce it in partnership with the government to say that this video or this piece of content was actually published in partnership with the health authorities to really help you get vaccinated, because that is the most important thing we need to do as a nation right now. And I think those were some of the efforts we were involved with to really try to solve some of these issues at our level.
Yeah. And what I'm also hearing from that, and this one, Ginny can also share what her thoughts. Now speed is even more important than ever, right? That when you're seeing misinformation, you also have to debunk really fast.
Yes. So I think the speed at which messages are being disseminated is amazing. I mean, this multiplier effect is, and the group sizes of all the different chats have been quite massive. And but on the reverse, right? The fact is that I can also push out debunking messages just as quickly. I just need to know what to address. And I think one of the important things we need to do as communicators is, it's never a one-way channel. Let's remember that. It's never a one-way channel. When people are reacting, when people are sharing certain types of news, it's important for us to know as well. And that's because we then can understand, like you said, right, the government picked up on the signals of the Moderna, Pfizer, battle of the best kind of thing, and then we can address them. So I think the very basis of communications is you need to know what the people around you are saying, sharing, speaking about. And with that, then I can react fast. I can say, hey, it's a millennial issue, it's a young people issue. Let me quickly work with SGAG on some content, and then I can debunk it. And when I work with a platform like SGAG, I have so many legs to run with that content, right? Because I don't just have your platform, which is already massive in its outreach. I can share that content back into the channels that were disseminating all the myths. And it will be assessed because people see SGAG and people go, hey, this is going to be interesting content. I'm going to watch this. I'm going to want to read this or watch this, or just look at your meme even. So I think it is a holistic view of communications that we have to bring into the picture.
It also sounds like it feels like there's more things to do now if you're a public communicator.
Yes, you've got to really all hands on deck, all eyes everywhere, all fingers on all mobile devices now. Yeah.
But also to mobilize the citizens, because every single person has a role to play, and the role of a single person within a group, I think, can't be discounted, and it's getting mobilizing those resources. Because in one of the studies we did, which was at the migrant workers community, I think in the early days when there was an outbreak in the migrant workers dormitories, right, there was a lot of news that was driving, heightened levels of fear that if you get COVID, this was going to happen, you were going to be taken away, and so on. But then I think the government utilized ambassadors, who were able to converse with certain community groups and so on, and they were able to debunk as well as counter some of the negative claims that were coming out, and that really helped.
Yeah. So I think it related to fake news, right, is also the confusion that it can cause. And even if we don't talk about fake news, right, sometimes when things like this are unfolding, initial information, there's very few of them in the beginning, or even scientists are not sure, tests are still being done. So there's also a lot of uncertainty involved. And for us public communicators, it's also a challenge, right? How do you communicate when things are still not sure, and yet people are clamoring for more information? How does SGAG address that?
Actually, maybe not from an SGAG lens. One very interesting phenomenon I noticed is that our ministers have become KOLs themselves, right? So if you think about them, for example, Minister Lawrence Wong has been publishing a lot of new updates on his personal Facebook page, and I myself go to his Facebook page to get the latest updates and his opinions and perspectives on whether there's going to be a lockdown, whether there's not going to be a lockdown, what are his thoughts on it. And I think that's also another interesting phenomenon to consider. What was previously, wait for the news, wait for the press release, wait for the authorities to say something, has now been Minister, maybe even like PM Jacinda Ardern out of New Zealand, live streaming herself to give her citizens direct updates from her own perspective. And I think that is also rapidly evolving as a key source of truth from the authorities. There's a level of authenticity from the horse's mouth. So I think that's also something very interesting that I'm seeing out of this, that our ministers are certainly hard at work, but also have become a key equation to public communication. And how they sort of craft the messages, how they deploy technology, how they use these platforms is also an equally important part in terms of distribution, building authenticity, building sort of some of these key pieces of information together to tackle a public pandemic.
Yeah. So that's, you're saying that's one good practice that you've observed during this time. How about Ginny? What other good practices in terms of public communication have you witnessed?
Well, I think when it comes to the subject of really what each of us can do, right, and in addressing, like you were saying, some of these fears or unknowns and things like that, I think in the early part of the pandemic, or rather in the early part of the vaccination exercise when it was newly open to the elderly, that was when there was a lot of misinformation, there was a lot of worries, there was some unknowns because people weren't quite processing what was the science of the Pfizer vaccine and everything like that, right? And the biggest challenge was, how then do I take all these data, all these facts, that's so scientific, and then translate it into a Hokkien conversation, a Teochew conversation, a Malay conversation, a Tamil conversation, because, well, I think those of us who have worked on very technical accounts, I'm sure you've got technical clients as well, we realize it's not easy to translate literally that conversation into the layman's speech and then further translate it into the language that is most comfortable to your target audience. And I come back again to target audience, who am I speaking with? And at that stage, our grassroots team was, we actually undertook quite a fun little project. We got the MP to sit down and address commonly asked questions, common misconceptions about the jab. We did a little video of just a couple of minutes long, and with the intent of making it easy for us to share with the elderly in the community in various languages. And we were quite happy because that actually went quite viral within the community. It went beyond the constituency, but I think it got some of the messages across. We had elderly who would tell us, oh, I saw your video, I was wondering about this and B and C, and then, I got the answers from your video. So I think we thought that worked very well. So I think that's exactly what you're saying. The ministers themselves, they are becoming the influencers, because Typically, previously, when you see a video about a minister, it's a clipping from the news. But today, we are creating content that they are of themselves that they are sharing out there to just make sure the information is getting into the right hands. Yeah.
So I think that's one thing is the practices, the good practices that we're seeing. But I think another important thing is to also how we determine whether these practices, the language we're using, even the delivery mechanisms that we're choosing, whether these are effective in terms of reaching the public. Prof May, I think you're doing work tracking emotions, right? I think that's also one thing that we should talk about. How are people feeling, right? And how can we communicate based on that knowledge that, okay, people are feeling a certain emotion at that moment?
That's right. It really kind of pertains also to Ginny's point about using all this huge amounts of data that we have to try and understand the pulse of the community much better. And in this regard, I mentioned to you that we have been tracking the social media, but we don't just want to know, how many posts have been done, what's the numbers, and so on. We see this as like an iceberg, and that's only the tip of the iceberg. But what's really underlying that are basket of emotions and the complexities of our own communities and societies. So we took the millions of data. In fact, last year we had over 500 million posts that are on Twitter and Facebook on COVID-19 conversations across the world. This year we've collected over 300 million so far. And we put them in psychosocial baskets, what we call the baskets of fear, which is when you feel scared and terrorized and have a lot of unknowns. We have a basket of anger, which is when people are upset and angry and post certain types of messages. So we use linguistics to put these in baskets. We have something called joy, but it's not really joy per se, but hope, gratitude, resilience, and so on, as well as sadness. And I just want to show you the world sentiments chart. This is across the whole world, how we tracked over the early parts of 2020. And you can see that the entire world, all the social media conversations started off in blue, which is to show that a lot of the messages were all about fear. And that went on for about 2-3 months. And then we had this rising red line, which was actually the underlying anger. And as the lockdown and other types of mechanisms started to kick in, there was a great amount of anger in all the messaging. And we were predicting, by April that this was going to overtake fear. And in health communication, fear is actually what drives the adherence to recommended behaviors and so on. And anger actually means that maybe you won't be adhering, and across the world, we see that by June and July, anger had overtaken fear across the world. And I also actually have this for singular countries. So it's very interesting to see Singapore, which actually, I'm happy to say that Singapore has quite a large amount of resilience, positive messages, and so on. Not this slide, just the one before, the one on the emotion still. I didn't put in the Singapore one here, but Singapore had a good amount of positive messaging compared to other countries like the United States, where there's like huge amounts of anger. And that overshadowed everything else over the months that followed. So I think that these are the ways that we can help public communication professionals to craft the messages, because depending on the sentiments of the population, what are their fears and the concerns and so on, it is possible to track over different weeks and make sure that the messages are crafted to the right population segments.
So I think also showing us that how knowing how people are feeling can also or should also influence our messaging strategies and efforts. I want to ask Carl now, because ASCII is known for a particular type of content, right? Does the public emotion matter in thinking of the content that you put out?
Absolutely. So I love this chart because I was just thinking back to pre-circuit breaker last year, and I think we make a lot of fun content, fun content, and there's a lot of humor involved. But I think we were entering a very dark phase of our maybe country's step to tackle COVID, and there was a lot of fear. We sensed a lot of fear. We wish we had data like that in real time, but we didn't. It was more of a general analysis on what we were seeing, on the data points of the comments we were reading, the kind of news articles that were coming out, and we sensed fear. And I think that's when we took a collective step as a company to question our existence. Why did we start SGAT in the first place? Why does it exist in the first place? And one of the key mission statements we have in the organization is to make the daily lives of Singaporeans better through content that we make. And that was something that we huddled together and said, look, I think in this really dark time, we really need to spread some joy. We need to find some way to lighten the mood, right? Even if we crack a lame joke and make you laugh for 3 seconds or less, it is a win for us. And I think that was a very clear mission for us during that season of Circuit Breaker, where we started encouraging people, because everyone was at home, we started encouraging our audiences to, hey, why don't you do something creative with us? Why don't you submit something to us? So we started crowdsourcing ideas based on themes, based on content ideas that we had, and we were receiving all-time high submissions. People were participating. We had themes of filming with your family, with your parents, themes of filming with your sibling, and we've never seen such engagements before, because normally I think Singaporeans are just too busy to film themselves or to submit stuff, and there was no prize money to be won. And this actually triggered, you know, a deep sense of maybe we can get more participation and rally people just to maybe stay fit, stay mentally active and healthy, and create these challenges with the outcome of content that was meant to be positive or lighthearted in nature. And that was something that was quite fun for us. And I think perhaps looking at this chart, it might have hopefully spiked a little bit more on the joy side, on the lightheartedness side, and hopefully reduce a bit more on the fear and negativity side.
How do you know that so one is participation, people are participating in all of these, but how do we see or observe whether it is actually making them feel better? I mean, what kinds of feedback do you get?
So I think in terms of feedback, that's where we collect data, right? So we collect data on the outcomes of the content. So we publish all of the submissions we received, and we started tracking performance in terms of measurements of views, engagements, the typical stuff, right? And we noticed that what is usually made by members of the public, usually when we upload it on our platforms pre-COVID, usually would fall flat. But because there was just so much demand for consumption, we were not able to make enough content, and we were struggling because we were also work from home. So this crowdsourcing and uploading of public content, members of the public, actually performed really well, way beyond expectations. For example, we had a 12-year-old boy who created a rap expressing his emotions about this period of how he felt. And it actually went viral, right? And I think that was something that was super cool for us, because we were also tracking the qualitative comments coming in, a bit of the sentiments, and people enjoyed it so much. They thanked the boy for writing this very expressive rap, right? And people were just sharing it and consuming it. So I think each metric of engaging through a comment, through a share, through a thank you message was something that gave us an indication of how public responded to it, and validated whether we should continue or whether we should stop or do something else.
Yeah. So I think we're seeing also the value of that people at this time also want to see something funny or something positive, right? With all the negativity that's going around us. But Ginny, we've discussed before, right? Also the spaces where effective public communication can actually work or can reach public more effectively. And we've talked about dark social.
Yes.
Maybe you can share with us your experience with these spaces.
I think, like my earlier example, I was talking about the videos that we produce to try and reach the elderly a little bit more effectively. I think it's very interesting that you shared your experience on how SGAT managed to work from home and still have enough content, you know, how you transformed in a certain way to be able to generate enough content. I think that's something that we have seen as well across the mainstream media. I think the mainstream media has evolved quite a fair bit, I mean, based on our observations over the last year and a half as well, right? So I think they have been doing their part in pushing out as much of the information, education as they can, and within a very short time. So I think literally as the task force is speaking, you get your breaking news alerts throughout those, you know, that half an hour or 1 hour that the media conference is going on. And some of our media, if you have the app, you've been pushed to update your apps and all, and you realize that it's been getting easier to share full articles, easier to share information, legit information. Let me just use the very colloquial term here. Legit information to many sources, even into dark social. So sometimes when I see, I mean, I'm in a lot of family advocate groups and things like that, right? So what I sometimes do is I see something come in and I go like, I need to debunk this, like Prof. May said, right? It's on me, it's on the individuals. And I'll go in and I'll look for my news article and I will find that easy to share link, and it's so easy now, it works so much more smoother now. So I think the mainstream has also come to the realization very quickly that, you know, I need to make it such that people don't rely on their traditional sources, but I need to ensure that I make it easy for people to feed the information into the dark social sources as well. So I think that has been a very good development. That has certainly helped because I'm receiving a lot of news links today, you know. So I think that has definitely grown the scene quite a fair bit. And as a communicator, I'm very happy because when your clients, I mean, let's get back to the bread and butter of the issue, yeah? When your clients themselves realize that, hey, I'm receiving my news even before I see it in print, even before I watch it on the news, I'm seeing pops of my news release, I'm seeing pops of my events. They also start to reassess how they view the world of communications. Yeah, and I can only be as successful as my client can understand how communications has evolved. So I think the upside of these very dark times has been a lot of learning and understanding of the communication world as we have evolved rapidly. Yeah.
I think that's an interesting point that you made, right? At a time when people can now get important information directly from who we call newsmakers, right? From the ministers, right? Or even from scientists and experts, right? Through social media. You can already get information directly from them. So what is left for the mainstream media to do? And yet, if we look at this slide from the Digital News Report, a survey done in January this year, what we saw is that trust. So we look at the sources of news. We're seeing that consistently in Singapore, we're getting most of our news from online sources. But if we go to the next slide, which looks at trust, mainstream. This is overall trust in the news. We've seen an increase from last year when the survey was done in January 2020. So we see an increase in the level of trust, overall trust in the news in 2021. And this is actually in the last 5 years that we've been doing this, doing Digital News Report in Singapore. We've noticed a steady decline in overall trust in the news. This is the first year where we actually saw an increase. So there's really something with the situation right now during this pandemic that, and also part of that maybe is the spread of fake news, that people are turning to traditional news sources again and trusting them again for information, which I think is really in demand at this particular time. So now I want to pivot to, okay, now that we know all these challenges, right, that we experience during this pandemic and how it has transformed how we do public communication, I think we should start looking forward now and maybe talk about what skills are needed, if I want to be an effective public communicator, right? And if my training is starting now, right? What skills should I develop? Let's start with Prof. May.
Yes, I think this is a question that the WKWSCI School, very seriously considers in our curriculum and how we train the future professionals. So one of the studies that we do across the Asia Pacific, and we do this every 2 years, is this Asia Pacific Communication Monitor, APCM. Actually, if you just key that in, you can find it. The report is freely shared. And in this APCM, this round, which was done in 2020, so we've done 2 rounds before, we actually saw titanic shifts. If we could share that slide, I think that is my last slide from my deck. We asked the communication professionals, right, in about 13 different countries in Asia Pacific, what are the most important strategic issues for communication professionals from now until 2023? And compared to the years past, we saw these shifts, like I've mentioned. And the two new categories that are now up there are coping with the digital evolution, and the social web is now the #1 priority. And the second one is using big data. Not this one, the previous one, please. The communication professionals. The one with, yes, this one, yeah, thank you. Is using big data and algorithms for communication. And actually, along that line, there's we in this report, if you go and look at it, there are more minute details in what that actually encompasses, what sort of platforms and so on. But previously, it used to be that building and maintaining trust was one of the key priorities, but now the top 2 priorities have shifted. And
Yeah.
you might have certain thoughts on.
Car?
Yeah, I think what we have discussed on this panel alone, as I was just listening and thinking, right, the role of a communicator has evolved, right? Some titanic shifts, as Prof mentioned. I think it starts from collection of data, understanding data, clean data. How do you even begin that process of social listening, for example, in some of the examples given? How do you collect the data, understand it, listen, and find insights? And then how do you begin to craft your story? How do you begin to craft your communication strategy? And that is often today linked very closely to the distribution platform, right? Different platforms require different distribution, different voice, different person who's uploading, right? Are you doing a TikTok dance? Are you doing a ministerial announcement on your own personal page? Are you writing on behalf of the Ministry of Health? I think the distribution links back to the crafting, and with distribution, again, being so complex, algorithms change, platforms are born, platforms die, right? How do you even begin to think about that to ensure that what you crafted is going to be effective in its distribution? And I think the lines are blurred, right? The reality is a modern day communicator requires different skill sets, all bundled into one. You need to collect, you need to craft, you need to distribute, and you need to consider the changing landscape that is going to be different 3 months in front of us, right? So that's the complexity, and maybe that's the fun of why we're in this industry.
Yeah. Or in other words, you need to do so many things. You need a lot of skills.
Yeah.
Ginny, what skills?
Literally octopi, of all our needs, right? And thanks for understanding how hard our work is now. Yeah, I think I love your research. I think that's exactly spot on. What are we looking for today? People who can navigate the evolving communications landscape, the rise of digital. We keep saying that, but it keeps rising. It doesn't stop rising. It just keeps rising and rising, right? And I think someone who can understand the data that's being crunched out, of what's going to work, what's not going to work. But I think there is another very human aspect that I would like to bring to this discussion. And that's basically then, do I just look at the data cold, or do I understand the human beings that I need to talk to behind that data, behind that insight? So for example, I like to ask in interviews, right? What do you read? What do you enjoy consuming? Do you enjoy looking at different sources of news? And I think that's something I hope to see in communicators that work with me, simply because I think if you are someone who enjoys reading news from different sources and playing with content from TikTok to SGAG, everywhere, then you get a sense, hey, this video, it might be a TikTok video by someone who's not so young, but somehow is resonating with all the young followers. Why? We start to gain insights. If one day I need to speak to a teenager in a campaign, I may not automatically go to someone who's a very young influencer anymore, right? I might go to one of these who actually has some influence. Maybe they are looked up to as a fun grandpa or something, right? So I think that enjoyment of consuming content, all types of content, beyond content that is targeted at me as a target audience, I think that's very important in a communicator. And if you can take it a step further, right? If I know that certain platforms are pleasing to my audience, or my audience is reacting in fear to certain topics, then what do? Do I just take the data, or do I then go and say, hey, let's look at the actual comments. Let's try and understand the individuals. While we sometimes tell clients, yes, sometimes they're just trolls making a lot of noise on your channel. But on the other hand, there are real people with real concerns. Not everyone's a troll. you know. So take the good with the bad. There is good. What is the good? You actually have given your consumers, your customers, your followers a chance to actually tell you. You just have to distill. So don't be afraid, right? Get out there, work with the different channels, work with digital, and then you can bring in the real insights that you need as well.
Yeah.
If I could just interject a bit, you know, I think what Carl and Ginny have both mentioned is so important, you know, for us at the Weekend Week School, for our curriculum and for our students. And in fact, you know, exactly what you said, all the different things that you need to balance together. We've even started recrafting not just the curriculum, but the classroom spaces, so that we have, you know, these kind of like convergent experiences happening. So if you look at one of our new classrooms, what you'll see is that, you know, we could have like the videotaping and then the blogging and the TikToking and, you know, all the different types of platforms can actually be concurrently done while you're in a kind of a joint setting. Previously, we used to kind of do these all pretty separately, but also, Ginny, what you shared is really, I think, foundational to why we're here today too, to celebrate, you know, the partnership, right, with APRW and the Weekend Week School, and for us, you know, really having that industry partnerships early on and injected into the student experiences, even from, you know, the first week of class, is so important. Yeah, in this changing media space. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really what this is showing us is the importance of collaborations, right? That we cannot operate in silos now. I think public communication really involves a lot of collaborations, and I think what we're doing today is showing how industry and academia can collaborate. So let me, I mean, also like going back to what Carl and Jeannie shared, I think, yeah, we're seeing the importance of technology, looking at big data, right? I think Jeannie also shared about the importance of small data, right? Because we still need to balance between, okay, what the data is telling us, but also what individuals, right, what people on the ground are saying and how they're feeling, right, and that would, I think, if we combine both skills, being able to sort big data, use all these technological tools, but also retain our humanity, our being sensitive, I think that's a good combination. Okay, I think we should have a few minutes for questions. If any of you have questions, you can type them in our Q&A box, and I'll be able to read that. I think we have a few minutes for your questions. Okay, let me just pick this up. Sorry. Okay, I'm looking at questions. If any of you have anything to ask to our panel members here before we wrap up. Okay. Okay. I think, yeah, still waiting for the questions to show up. I would maybe while we're waiting for questions, I'll probably ask another question. So, with everything that we talked about, all the challenges, and it looks like all the many things and skills that a good public communicator has to have, would you say that is this a good career option? You know, should I be a public communicator, especially at this time? You know, I mean, seeing what we're seeing now. Carl, let's start with you.
Well, absolutely. I am not from I wish I had graduated from this school. I unfortunately was not from this school. I think the dynamism of the industry, layered in with technology like what we discussed today, presents so many opportunities. And what we discussed today might be irrelevant in 6 months' time, probably. And I think that is really dynamic. It's really fast-paced. It's filled with learning opportunities, upside. And I think for me, it's a definite yes, a wonderful place to be in, to learn and really evolve as the world changes in the way it communicates.
Thanks, Carl. Ginny?
It's definitely exciting. Not a dull moment, I promise you that. I think what has kept me in this field for over 20 years now is I haven't stopped learning, right? From my clients, from the different industries. I do science, I do real estate, I do education, I do a whole range of clients. And I keep learning about new things from my clients. I learn about new things from people like Carl who teach me new things in the evolving comms world. I come to WikiMe and I learn from you, right? Academics like you who have data to help me improve myself as a communicator. So I think in today's world where there's so many distractions and you think that, oh, I need to learn different things, I need to know new things all the time, I think this has kept me going. I'm not very young, but I still feel energetic enough to want to continue because I still feel that there's so much more to learn. It's never static. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, if the current situation in COVID-19, if it's taught us anything in the communication world, it's just how important communication is, how it can be in so many different types of industries, how it has to be front and center, whether we're going to communicate science, medicine, policies, and indeed business and corporate news and information as well. So communication is the place to be. I would tell the students that there is a wonderful future ahead, and it'll never die as a field. You'll always have a job as a communicator.
Good to hear. Thanks so much, Prof. Ming. Back to you, Sejal.
Thank you so much for the insightful sharing. Even as a final year student, it's really, really important to know all of this, especially with content platforms and even our ministers being our KOLs. Is really interesting to hear, going to the public relations and advertising industry. So thank you all once again.